Welcome to MUSEVENISIS, a chronology of broken promises, a comprehensive list of agreements between Uganda's government and the Acholi people, 1985 to 2026. Here is the exhaustive chronological list of all major agreements and significant negotiations between Museveni's government and groups representing the Acholi, all war, including the status and reasons for violation or failure. The Nairobi Agreement is now one on our list on December 1985. This is the foundational agreement in this context, signed in Nairobi, Kenya, between the Ugandan government of Tito Okello and the National Resistance Army NRM rebel group led by Museveni. After Tito Okello overthrew Milton Obote, he invited all parties to join in national reconciliation. Museveni's NRM, which had been fighting a guerrilla war, eventually joined negotiations brokered by Kenyan President Daniel Arap Moi following the failure of initial talks in Dar es Salaam. The arduous negotiations continued from August 26 to December 17, 1985. The final agreement called for a ceasefire, demilitarization of Kampala, integrations of the NRA and government forces, and absorption of the NRA leadership into the military council. Article 17C provided for a commission of inquiry into human rights violations since independence. Article 7 prescribed a national army numbering less than 8,500 troops, which would have meant unemployment for a large percentage of the UNLA's 15,000 men. The agreement broke down almost immediately. The UNLA was disincentivized from implementing the peace plan, as the human rights inquiry would likely implicate many of its leaders in abuses during Obote II. The Kenyan negotiating team lacked in-depth knowledge of Uganda's situation and key personalities, and the negotiations excluded relevant Ugandan organizations, including political parties. Whether Museveni was ever interested in a negotiated agreement is questionable. He may have merely used the 4-month negotiations to present a positive image and reorganize his forces, while the NRA had the capacity to achieve outright military victory. Ultimately, Museveni abandoned the agreement and captured Kampala by force on January 26, 1986. This event is cited as the root cause of subsequent Acholi rebellions. Second on my list is the UPDA peace agreement of 1988. After Museveni took power, his government successfully negotiated a peace deal with the Uganda People's Democratic Army, that's UPDA, a key Acholi rebel group formed in July 1986 from former UNLA soldiers and political leaders of the Obote II and Tito Okello government. The UPDA was the first group from Acholi to take up arms against Museveni's government. The background to this agreement involved significant human rights abuses by government, as reported by United Nations forces, that fueled the rebellion. Former UNLA soldiers who surrendered weapons complained of indiscipline, mistreatment, torture, and killings by NRA soldiers supervising disarmament, including rape. A May 10, 1986 order requiring all former UNLA soldiers to report to a army headquarters in Kampala fueled fears of massacres similar to those following Idi Amin's takeover. Acholi elders, led by Tiberio Kenya Twoma, initiated peace efforts in October 1986, concerned about the humanitarian crisis. President Museveni approved talks, directing General Salim Saleh to commence negotiations. In April 1988, the government concluded a peace agreement with the back of the UPDA leadership within Uganda. Between 5,000 and 10,000 UPDA members surrendered and received amnesty, with several thousand UPDA fighters integrated into the NRA. However, this agreement was a success story that contributed to the problem. The exile leadership and some UPDA guerrillas rejected the agreement, and many allied themselves with Joseph Kony's Holy Spirit movement, forming the core of what would become the Lord Resistance Army, that's LRA. The LRA felt excluded from this process and decided to continue the fight, leading to over 2 more decades of devastating war. 3. The Betty Bigombe talks, 1993 to 1994. This was the first major direct attempt to negotiate with Joseph Kony's LRA. Betty Bigombe, a respected Acholi, was appointed Minister of State in the Prime Minister's office in charge of the pacification of the North in 1988 and initiated negotiations with different rebel groups, with the LRA being the last. Bigombe managed to establish talks in mid-1993 with Joseph Kony, the self-styled mystic leading the LRA, who claimed to be a spirit medium wanting a government based on the 10 Commandments. As a fellow Acholi, Bigombe had credibility with both Kony and President Museveni. The talk showed promise, with Bigombe working to build confidence and understand what drove the rebels to take up arms. However, the talks collapsed in February 1994. The initiative failed when Kony refused to surrender, and the government ultimately decided to resume military operations. The LRA insurgency intensified dramatically following the collapse. A decade passed before any significant peace efforts would again be made. Bigombe later resumed mediation efforts in 2004-2005 without ministerial status, but these efforts also faced significant challenges, including the issuance of ICC arrest warrants in October 2005, which made Kony's surrender impossible. Number 4 is the Juba peace talks, 2006-2008. This is the most significant near miss in the search for peace. The talks began in July 2006 in Juba, Southern Sudan, mediated by South Sudan's Riek Machar, and were considered Northern Uganda's best chance for peace in years. The LRA delegation, which included spokesman Obonyo Lweny, warned at the opening ceremony that acceptance of peace talks should not be interpreted as military weakness. The government delegation was led by Ruakana Rugunda. All 5 phases of the final peace agreement, FPA, were reportedly settled by negotiators. A key component was Agenda Item 3, which created a framework for accountability and reconciliation, proposing a mix of formal justice and traditional Acholi rituals like Matoput to address the outstanding International Criminal Court indictments against LRA leaders issued in October 2005. However, Joseph Kony failed to show up for the signing ceremony on April 10, 2008. The primary sticking point was the ICC arrest warrant for Kony and his commanders, while the Ugandan government proposed alternative justice mechanism and offered amnesty. The LRA leadership refused to sign the agreement, with the indictment hanging around their necks. Archbishop John Baptist Odama of Gulu noted that the ICC warrants blocked the peace process, as it was impossible to tell LRA soldiers to accept amnesty while the threat of ICC arrest hung over them. Betty Bigombe confirmed that the indictment made Kony's surrender impossible, though she believed other commanders could be lured away. And number 5 is agreements on cattle compensation, post-2006 through 2025. Following the Juba peace talks, the government committed to compensating the Acholi people for cattle lost during decades of conflict. Remember, cattle was the bank of Acholi. That was the traditional way of keeping wealth, including the LRA war. This commitment was formalized through instruments, including the Juba peace talk agreement and the peace agreement. In 2022, President Museveni launched a compensation program for households in Acholi, Lao, and Teso sub-regions who lost livestock during the 1970s insurgencies and the LRA war. The government has spent approximately shillings 150 to 159 billion on compensation claims across the 3 regions. According to Government statistics as of October 2025, 4,836 claimants in the Acholi sub-region have been compensated, including 583 claimants in Omor district who received shillings 5.6 billion. Overall, 28,000 claimants have been paid, with payments to 16,000 more pending, though an additional 12,000 names have since emerged, raising concerns of fraud. However, Acholi leaders, including Nobat Mao, have protested that the process is marred by corruption, fraud, ghost names, and verification gaps. Mao noted that the lawyers and the thieves came in and caused more confusion when claimants were told to accept out-of-court settlements. Rodoviro Nana Chano II, paramount chief of Acholi, acknowledged that shillings 3.8 trillion has been injected into northern Uganda, but said corruption and weak governance have slowed its impact. In August 2025, President Museveni ordered the immediate publication of all cattle compensation lists and a one-month audit to verify all claimants, acknowledging that even with direct payments, corruption has crept in. The president has reframed the initiative as a rehabilitation scheme rather than compensation, arguing that war effects cannot be individually quantified. In October 2025, Museveni announced a new harmonized model where every homestead would receive 5 cows, with special consideration for Acholi due to their prolonged suffering. But can it happen? Says the 2022 DP-NRM Cooperation Agreement, July 2022. This foundational political agreement brought Nobat Mao and the Democratic Party into formal cooperation with the ruling NRM. Signed in July 2022 at State House between President Museveni and DP President General Nobat Mao, the agreement granted the NRM formal collaboration with DP in matters of governance and national dialogue. The agreement committed the DP to cooperate with the NRM in supporting the government's governance agenda, including backing parliamentary votes on matters of confidence and supply for the duration of the current parliament, and supporting procedural motions in the House and in select and sessional committees. The agreement also provided for the appointment of DP members to cabinet who would be bound by cabinet rules on confidentiality, public duty, and personal interest. Following the signing, Mao was appointed Minister for Justice and Constitutional Affairs and took the oath on August 2nd, 2022. Other DP figures, including Gerald Sirenda, secured strategic positions in government. Mao has consistently maintained that this is not a merger, but a joint venture between independent companies. DP remains independent and has not joined a coalition with NRM. The agreement sparked fierce internal party conflict. In March 2025, an anti-Mao faction led by MP Richard Sembala, Dr. Michael Luluma, and Richard Lumu attempted to terminate the agreement and suspend Mao. In March 2026, the Constitutional Court dismissed the petition challenging the agreement, ruling that the issues raised concerned internal party governance rather than constitutional interpretation, and that the agreement did not raise substantive constitutional requests requiring court intervention. 7. The 2025 Operation Harmony Agreement, March 2025. This is a political cooperation agreement specifically involving Acholi leaders. On March 13, 2025, President Museveni met with about 12 opposition leaders from the Acholi sub-region, including Nobat Mao and other Acholi MPs. The agenda was to negotiate their exit from the opposition and develop strategies to help Museveni secure votes in the Acholi sub-region through a framework called Operation Harmony, and Museveni got all the votes. While this agreement built upon the existing DP-NRM cooperation, it was specifically targeted at Acholi sub-region development and political support. Critics, including some Acholi religious and cultural leaders condemned this engagement as Acam Ngwinya selfishness, accusing the MPs of selling out for personal gain. Local government officials pointed out that the concept note failed to address long-standing critical issues such as their power land conflicts, Balolo and Ashwa ranch ownership. Notably, Operation Harmony has also taken on a separate implementation meaning. By December 2025, the term referred to enforcement of presidential executive orders number 3 of 2023 and number 2 of 2025 aimed at expelling Balolo, that's nomadic pastoralists from northern Uganda. The office of the Prime Minister handed over motorcycles to veterinary officers in 5 districts, Amoro, Nwaya, Madio, Lok, Apache, and Gulu, to facilitate enforcement with intelligence-led operations resulting in the eviction of 53,160 Balolo cattle since 2023. Implementation has faced challenges including cattle being moved to remote areas, lack of adequate holding grounds, and collision between some local landowners and Balolo. 8. The September 2025 Democratic Party presidential decision. While not a formal agreement with the government, this consequential decision flowed directly from the 2022 cooperation agreement. In September 2025, the Democratic Party announced it would not present a presidential candidate for the 2026 elections, marking only the second time since multi-party politics returned that DP has done so. Mao openly declared he would back Museveni's re-election bid, saying he is neither ashamed nor afraid to support the NRM candidate. Mao has defended the cooperation as a path to smooth transition of power, arguing that elections alone will not remove Museveni and that genuine change requires negotiation and national dialogue. He maintains that the agreement remains under review, with new terms to be discussed after the 2026 polls. This exhaustive list demonstrates the complex and often tragic history of attempts to achieve peace and reconciliation between Museveni's government and the peoples of northern Uganda, from the failed Nairobi Agreement of 1985 that set the stage for decades of conflict, through the near success of the Juba talks thwarted by international justice mechanisms, to the ongoing political realignments and compensation efforts that continue to face implementation challenges today. The question is, are the Acholi most fooled tribe in Uganda, or are we just fools?